When the billionaire James Sterling saw his wife pour Coca-Cola over their maid's daughter, the world froze. In that sticky silence, his next move changed everything. The mansion was silent until the sound of glass shattered it. "Get that child out of my house," hissed Victoria Sterling, her crystal voice sharp as ice. And then came the splash. Coca-Cola cascading down a little girl's hair. Laughter, shock, silence. In that moment, dignity, innocence, and decency drowned together on the marble floor. From the shadows, a man watched. The husband, the billionaire, the one who'd built empires but lost sight of his own humanity. In that single, cruel moment, something inside him broke, and something greater awakened. This is the story of how a single act of cruelty turned into a reckoning that no one saw coming. And before I forget, where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Enjoy the story. A whisper of a girl in a house full of secrets. This was the world Lily knew. A place of polished floors and hushed tones where her mother, Sarah, worked as a maid. But a quiet life can be shattered in an instant, and for Lily, that instant was about to arrive. The afternoon sun streamed through the towering windows of the Sterling mansion, illuminating dust motes dancing in the silent air. 10-year-old Lily sat on a stool in the cavernous kitchen, her small fingers carefully tracing the patterns on a blue and white porcelain plate. Her mother, Sarah, was in the grand dining room, preparing for the evening's charity gala. Lily was supposed to be invisible. It was the first rule of her visits to this palace of glass and stone. Be seen as little as possible, and heard not at all. Her blonde hair, the color of pale corn silk, was tied back in a neat ponytail. She wore a simple cotton dress, a stark contrast to the opulence that surrounded her. The kitchen was an empire of stainless steel and marble, a place of delicious smells and the quiet, rhythmic hum of expensive machinery. Lily loved it here. It was a world away from their small, two-bedroom apartment, a world where everything was clean and bright and full of possibilities. From the dining room, Lily could hear the sharp, clipped tones of Mrs. Victoria Sterling, the lady of the house. Victoria was a woman carved from ice, beautiful and brittle. Her voice was like the tinkling of shattered glass, sharp and unpleasant. Lily had learned to stay out of her way. Mrs. Sterling did not like children, especially not the children of her staff. "Sarah, for heaven's sake, be careful with that centerpiece. It's a Baccarat original. It cost more than your car." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah's voice was a soft murmur, a gentle stream against the rocks of Victoria's disapproval. Lily's father, a kind man with a warm laugh, had died 2 years ago, leaving Sarah to raise Lily on her own. The job at the Sterling mansion was a lifeline, the salary just enough to keep their heads above water. Lily knew this. She understood the unspoken rules, the delicate balance of their lives. So she sat on her stool, quiet as a mouse, and waited for her mother to finish her work. Suddenly, the kitchen door swung open, and Victoria Sterling swept in, a whirlwind of silk and expensive perfume. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, immediately fell on Lily. "What is that doing here?" she demanded, her voice laced with disgust. Sarah hurried in behind her, her face etched with worry. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. My babysitter canceled at the last minute. I had no choice." "No choice." Victoria's laugh was a harsh, ugly sound. "There is always a choice. And the choice is that I do not want the help's children in my house." Lily shrank back on her stool, her heart pounding in her chest. She wished she could disappear, melt into the floorboards. "It won't happen again, ma'am," Sarah promised, her voice trembling slightly. Victoria's eyes narrowed. She was holding a tall glass of Coca-Cola, the ice cubes clinking against the crystal. She took a slow, deliberate sip, her gaze never leaving Lily. "You people don't understand, do you?" she said, her voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "You come into our homes, you clean our messes, and you think that gives you the right to bring your clutter with you." She took a step closer to Lily, her shadow falling over the small girl. Lily could smell her perfume, a cloying, floral scent that made her feel sick. "She's just a child," Sarah whispered, taking a protective step towards her daughter. "And she needs to learn her place," Victoria snapped. And then, in a movement that was both shockingly fast and horrifyingly slow, she upended the glass of Coca-Cola over Lily's head. The cold liquid drenched her hair, her face, her dress. The sticky sweetness of it, the fizz of the carbonation, the sharp sting of the cold. It was a sensory assault. Ice cubes slid down her back, making her gasp. The dark, bubbly liquid dripped from her eyelashes, her nose, her chin. It was a baptism of cruelty, a sticky, public shame. Lily froze, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. She didn't cry. The shock was too great for tears. She just sat there, small and silent and drenched in soda, the smell of it filling her nostrils, the cold of it seeping into her bones. Sarah let out a choked cry, rushing to her daughter's side. Lily, oh, my baby. Victoria Sterling watched them, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. She placed the empty glass on the marble countertop with a soft clink. Now, she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction, perhaps you'll think twice before you bring your baggage to my home again. She turned and swept out of the kitchen, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than any sound. Sarah wrapped her arms around Lily, her own tears now falling freely. It's okay, baby. It's okay. Mommy's here. But it wasn't okay. Something had broken in that moment, something precious and fragile. The innocence of a child, the dignity of a mother, the quiet, unspoken contract between employer and employee. All of it shattered, lying in a puddle of Coca-Cola on the floor. What neither of them knew, what Victoria Sterling in her arrogance could never have imagined, was that they were not alone. James Sterling, the billionaire owner of the mansion, had been in the adjacent study, the door slightly ajar. He had heard his wife's raised voice, the sound of his maid's soft pleading, and then the gasp. He had stepped out just in time to see the end of it, the empty glass in his wife's hand, the small, blonde girl drenched and shivering, his maid's heartbroken sobs. He stood in the doorway, a tall, imposing figure in a perfectly tailored suit. His face, usually a calm, unreadable mask, was now a storm of emotions. He looked at his wife, at the cruel, triumphant smile on her face, and then at the small, shivering girl, and something inside him, something he had long thought buried, began to stir. He was a man who had built an empire on logic and reason, on cold, hard facts. He was not a man given to emotional displays. But what he had just witnessed was not a matter of business. It was a matter of basic human decency. And in that moment, he knew, with a certainty that was as solid and unshakable as the foundations of his tallest skyscraper, that this would not stand. His wife, so pleased with her petty cruelty, had made a terrible mistake. She had underestimated the quiet girl in the simple cotton dress. She had underestimated the fierce love of a mother. And most of all, she had underestimated her own husband. James Sterling looked at the scene before him, the scene his wife had created, and made a decision that would change everything. He took a step into the kitchen, his shoes making a soft, authoritative sound on the marble floor. "Victoria," he said, his voice quiet, almost conversational, but with an undercurrent of steel that made his wife's smile falter. She turned, surprised to see him. "James, darling, I saw what you did," he said, his voice cutting through her excuses like a diamond through glass. And in that moment, in the cold, clear depths of his eyes, Victoria Sterling saw not the indulgent husband she knew, but a stranger, a man she had never met before, a man who was looking at her as if she were something he had just found on the bottom of his shoe. The fallout was immediate, but not in the way anyone expected. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. James Sterling was a man who played chess, not checkers. He did not make scenes. He made moves. He walked over to Sarah and Lily, his large frame a comforting presence in the suddenly tense kitchen. He knelt down, so that he was at eye level with the small, shivering girl. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Lily, still in shock, could only nod, her blonde hair plastered to her face. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a silk handkerchief. He began to gently dab at her face, his movements slow and deliberate. "My name is James," he said softly. "What's your name?" "Lily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's a beautiful name," he said. He looked at her simple cotton dress, now stained and ruined. "I'm very sorry about your dress." He then looked up at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "Sarah," he said, his voice firm but kind, "please take Lily upstairs. Get her cleaned up. There's a new dress in one of the guest rooms, a gift for a friend's daughter. It should fit her. Take the rest of the day off. I'll have my driver take you home." Sarah, stunned into silence, could only nod. She helped Lily to her feet, and together they walked out of the kitchen, leaving James alone with his wife. Victoria, who had been watching this exchange with a mixture of fury and disbelief, finally found her voice. "James, what do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "You're taking their side? The side of the help." James stood up, his full height seeming to fill the room. He turned to face his wife, his face a cold, hard mask. "There are no sides, Victoria," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "There is only right and wrong. And what you did was wrong." "It was a lesson," she insisted, her voice rising. "She needed to learn her place." Her place. James's voice was laced with a contempt that made her flinch. "Her place is to be a child who is treated with kindness and respect, a child who is not used as a pawn in your petty games of power." "Petty games?" she shrieked. "I am your wife. I am the lady of this house. I will not be disrespected by the staff." "You were not disrespected," James said, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "You were the one who showed a profound lack of respect. You humiliated a child. You abused your position. And you did it in my house." He took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers. "I have spent my life building a reputation for fairness, for integrity, for decency. And you, in one single act of casual cruelty, have threatened to undo it all." "Don't be so dramatic," she scoffed, though she was beginning to feel a tremor of fear. She had never seen him like this. "I am not being dramatic," he said. "I am being precise. The charity gala tonight is one of the most important events of the year for me. The people attending are not just my friends. They are my business partners, my investors, the lifeblood of my company. And they are all people who value appearances." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And what kind of appearance would it be if the host of the gala was a woman who bullies children?" Victoria's face went pale. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "Wouldn't I?" he said, his voice a soft, dangerous promise. "You have put me in an impossible position, Victoria, and now you will have to live with the consequences." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, alone and trembling, in the wreckage of her own making. Upstairs, in a guest bathroom that was larger than their entire living room, Sarah gently washed the sticky soda out of Lily's hair. The new dress, a beautiful creation of blue silk, lay on the bed. It was the most beautiful dress Lily had ever seen. But she didn't want a new dress. She wanted her old one, the one that wasn't stained with shame. She wanted to go home. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Why was she so mean? Sarah held her close, her heart aching for her daughter's pain. "I don't know, baby," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Some people are just broken inside, and they try to break other people to make themselves feel whole." She finished washing Lily's hair, and then helped her into the new dress. It was a perfect fit. Lily looked like a princess in a fairy tale, but she didn't feel like a princess. She felt small and lost and dirty. Downstairs, James Sterling was on the phone. His voice was calm and controlled, but the words he spoke were like a declaration of war. "Get me everything you can on my wife's family," he said to the man on the other end of the line. "Her father's business, her brother's investments, any skeletons they have in their closets. I want to know everything, and I want it by morning." He hung up the phone and stood for a long moment, looking out the window at the perfectly manicured lawns of his estate. He had always known his wife was shallow and vain. He had married her for reasons that had more to do with business than with love. But he had never known she was cruel. And that, he decided, was a line that could not be uncrossed. The charity gala began at 7 o'clock. The Sterling mansion was transformed into a glittering wonderland of crystal and candlelight. The great and the good of the city arrived in a parade of expensive cars, their jewels and their laughter filling the night air. Victoria Sterling, dressed in a stunning gown of crimson silk, greeted her guests with a smile that was as bright as it was false. She was the perfect hostess, charming and witty and utterly in control. But underneath the carefully constructed facade, she was a nervous wreck. James had not spoken to her since their confrontation in the kitchen. He had been a cold, distant presence at her side, his silence more damning than any accusation. She scanned the crowd, looking for any sign that the story of the afternoon's events had leaked. But there was nothing. The smiles were all genuine, the laughter all real. She began to relax. Perhaps she had overreacted. Perhaps James had just been angry in the moment. Perhaps it would all blow over. And then she saw them, standing near the grand staircase, in the shadow of a towering marble statue, were Sarah and Lily. Sarah was wearing a simple but elegant black dress, the uniform of the catering staff. But Lily was wearing the blue silk dress, the dress from the guest room, the dress that was meant for a princess. They were not hiding in the shadows. They were standing there, in plain sight, for all the world to see. And Lily, her blonde hair now clean and shining, her face scrubbed and fresh, looked not like the maid's daughter, but like a guest, an honored guest. Victoria's blood ran cold. James was at her side in an instant, his hand on her arm, his grip like a vice. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed, her voice low and furious. "They are my guests," he said, his voice calm and even. "Your guests?" she sputtered. "The maid and her daughter? At my party." "Our party," he corrected her gently. "And yes, they are my guests, and you will treat them with the respect that you would show to any other guest in this house." His eyes were like chips of ice. "Do you understand me, Victoria?" She understood. She understood that this was not a suggestion. It was an order. And she understood, with a dawning, sickening horror, that this was only the beginning. Victoria stood frozen, her painted smile threatening to crack. A low murmur rippled through the ballroom as guests began to notice the unlikely trio by the staircase. They saw James Sterling, the titan of industry, standing protectively beside a woman in a simple black dress and a small, blonde girl in a luminous blue silk gown that looked far too expensive for a servant's child. Whispers began to circulate. Quiet questions passed between sips of champagne. Who were they? What was happening? The scene was a masterpiece of subtle social warfare. James had not raised his voice, had not made a grand accusation. He had simply changed the board. By placing Sarah and Lily in the center of his opulent world, he had made them visible. And in doing so, he had made Victoria's cruelty visible too, without saying a word. Victoria, a creature of appearances, knew she was trapped. To make a scene would be to confirm the very ugliness James was exposing. To ignore them would be impossible. She was cornered, exposed in her own home, and she had no one to blame but herself. With a monumental effort of will, she composed her features into a mask of graciousness. "Of course, darling," she said, her voice a brittle imitation of warmth. "Our guests are my guests." She turned a blinding smile towards Sarah. "You must be Sarah? James has told me so much about you." It was a lie, a desperate attempt to seize control of the narrative, but it was all she had. Sarah, who had never exchanged more than a handful of pleasantries with the woman, simply nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. James guided Sarah and Lily further into the room. He moved with a calm authority that quelled the rising tide of gossip. He introduced them not as his maid and her daughter, but as my dear friends, Sarah and Lily. The title was a shield, a declaration of their worth that no one in that room dared to question, at least not to his face. He led them to a small, secluded table near the French doors that opened onto the moonlit garden. "Please," he said, pulling out a chair for Sarah, then one for Lily. "Sit. Relax. I'll get you both something to drink." Lily, who had been clutching her mother's hand, slid onto the plush velvet chair. The room was a dizzying kaleidoscope of light and sound. People in beautiful clothes laughed and talked, their jewelry sparkling like captured stars. It was terrifying and magical all at once. From this vantage point, she could see the buffet table, a mountain of food more elaborate than any she had ever imagined. Tiny cakes, shimmering jellies, and a chocolate fountain that seemed to flow endlessly. James returned with 2 glasses of sparkling apple cider. He handed one to Lily with a small, reassuring smile. "For you, Princess Lily," he said. The name, meant as a simple kindness, made Lily's heart give a little flutter. For a moment, she forgot the cold shock of the Coca-Cola, the sting of Victoria's words. She was a princess in a blue silk dress, drinking sparkling cider at a grand ball. It was a dream, a fragile, impossible dream. Sarah watched the exchange, her emotions in a turmoil. She was grateful, profoundly grateful, for Mr. Sterling's kindness. He had defended them, had shown them a respect she had never expected. But she was also terrified. She was a maid, a servant. She did not belong here, in this world of wealth and power. She felt like a trespasser, a fraud, and she feared the inevitable consequences. What would happen when the party was over? When the dream ended? Would she still have a job? A way to provide for her daughter? Her fears were not unfounded. Across the room, Victoria was in damage control mode. She moved through her guests with a practiced ease, her laughter a little too bright, her smile a little too fixed. "Oh, James, he has such a soft heart," she would say with a dismissive wave of her hand when a guest would subtly inquire about the new arrivals. "Always taking in strays. It's a little charity project of his." The girl's father was a distant relative of one of his war buddies, a real hero. Tragic story. James felt he had to do something. She was spinning a tale, a plausible lie to explain away the inexplicable. She was painting James as a benevolent philanthropist and herself as the tolerant, understanding wife. It was a clever strategy, and for some, it worked. They nodded, murmured their sympathies, and moved on. But others, the ones who knew James Sterling, the ones who knew his reputation as a shrewd, unsentimental businessman, were not so easily fooled. They saw the tension in Victoria's eyes, the cold fury simmering beneath her polished veneer. And they watched, and they waited. One of these observers was a man named Arthur Vance, James's oldest friend and his lawyer. Arthur was a quiet, unassuming man with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He had seen the whole drama unfold, and he knew, better than anyone, what James was capable of when he was pushed too far. He made his way over to James's table, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "James," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A bold move. A necessary one," James replied, his eyes never leaving Lily, who was now tentatively reaching for a miniature pastry from a passing tray. "Victoria is not happy," Arthur observed. "Victoria's happiness is no longer my primary concern," James said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Arthur took a slow sip of his whiskey. "This is about more than a spilled drink, isn't it?" James turned to look at his friend, and for the first time that evening, Arthur saw the full extent of the anger in his eyes. It was a cold, controlled rage, the kind that was far more dangerous than any hot-tempered outburst. "It's about a line," James said. "A line that was crossed. You can't build an empire, Arthur, not a real one, not one that lasts, on a foundation of cruelty. You can't treat people like they are disposable, like they are less than human, and expect to maintain any sense of your own humanity." He paused, watching as Lily took a delicate bite of the pastry, her eyes widening in delight. "That little girl," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "She has more dignity in her little finger than my wife has in her entire body. Her mother has worked for me for 3 years. She has been loyal, hardworking, and unobtrusive. She has raised that child on her own, with a quiet strength that I can only admire. And for that, she gets this. Humiliation. Disrespect. Not in my house, Arthur. Not while I am alive." Arthur nodded slowly. He had known James for 30 years. He had seen him build his company from nothing, had watched him navigate the treacherous waters of the business world with a skill and a ruthlessness that was legendary. But he had never seen him like this. He had never seen him so personally invested. "What are you going to do?" Arthur asked. "I'm going to teach my wife a lesson," James said, his voice a low, dangerous promise. A lesson in consequences. The lesson began sooner than Victoria expected. Midway through the evening, James took to the stage. He was scheduled to give a speech, a standard thank you to the donors of the charity. But tonight, his speech would be different. He stood at the podium, a commanding figure in the warm glow of the spotlight. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice calm and resonant. "We are here to support a wonderful cause, a cause that is dedicated to helping children in need. Children who, through no fault of their own, have been dealt a difficult hand in life." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "We, in this room, are the lucky ones. We have been blessed with wealth, with privilege, with power. And with that power comes a responsibility. A responsibility to be kind. A responsibility to be just. A responsibility to remember that the true measure of a person is not how they treat their equals, but how they treat those who they perceive to be beneath them." His gaze fell on his wife, who was standing in the front row, a fixed smile on her face. The smile faltered. "Tonight," James continued. I was reminded of this responsibility in a very personal way. I witnessed an act of casual cruelty, an act of bullying that was directed at a child who was a guest in my own home. A gasp went through the crowd. The whispers started again, this time louder, more urgent. This child, James said, his voice ringing with a conviction that sent a chill down Victoria's spine, is the granddaughter of a man who was a hero. A man who fought for this country, who sacrificed for this country, who gave his life for this country. His name was Sergeant Michael Donovan, and he was my friend. He looked directly at Lily, who was watching him with wide, unblinking eyes. His granddaughter, James said, his voice thick with an emotion that no one in that room had ever heard from him before, is a guest of honor here tonight, and I would like you all to join me in welcoming her. He stepped away from the podium and walked to the edge of the stage, extending his hand to Lily. Lily, he said, his voice a gentle invitation. Would you come up here, please? For a moment, Lily froze. All eyes were on her. The weight of their stares was a physical thing, pressing down on her. But then she looked at her mother, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. And she looked at Mr. Sterling, at the kind, steady hand he was offering her. And she was not afraid. She slid off her chair and walked to the stage, her blue silk dress shimmering in the light. She placed her small hand in his, and he gently led her to the podium. The room erupted in applause. It was a thunderous, sustained ovation, a wave of sound that washed over the small girl in the blue dress. It was applause for her grandfather, for the idea of justice, of right and wrong. It was a public and undeniable rebuke of the cruelty she had suffered. Victoria Sterling stood in the front row, her face a mask of stone. The applause was like a physical assault, each clap a blow to her pride, her reputation, her carefully constructed world. She was being judged, tried, and convicted in the court of public opinion, and her own husband was the chief prosecutor. In that moment, she did not feel remorse. She did not feel shame. She felt only a cold, hard, reptilian fury. He would pay for this. She would make him pay. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Sarah and Lily. They were treated like royalty. People came to their table to shake Sarah's hand, to tell Lily how beautiful she looked in her dress. The mayor of the city, a portly man with a booming laugh, insisted on having his picture taken with Lily. A famous actress, a woman Lily had only seen in movies, knelt down and told her that she was the bravest girl she had ever met. It was all too much, too overwhelming. Sarah, caught between gratitude and a deep, gnawing anxiety, could only smile and nod and try to keep her composure. Lily, in the way of children, simply accepted it. It was a fairy tale, and in fairy tales, anything could happen. At 10 o'clock, James's driver, a kind, elderly man named Thomas, drove them home. As the car pulled away from the glittering mansion, Lily fell asleep in her mother's arms, her small face peaceful in the soft glow of the streetlights. Sarah looked out the window at the city lights flashing by, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Her life, which had been so simple and so predictable, had suddenly been turned upside down. She did not know what the future held. She did not know if she still had a job, or a home, or a way to provide for her daughter. But as she held her sleeping child in her arms, she knew one thing for certain. She was proud of her daughter, who had faced cruelty with a quiet dignity that was far beyond her years, and proud of herself for having raised such a child. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Back at the mansion, the party was winding down. The last of the guests had departed, leaving behind a silence that was more profound than the noise that had preceded it. James Sterling stood alone in the grand ballroom, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked around at the remnants of the party, at the half-empty glasses and the discarded napkins. It was a scene of triumph, a battle won. But he felt no joy, only a cold, hard sense of resolve. He had drawn a line in the sand. He had declared his intentions to the world. And now, he had to see it through to the end. He heard a soft footstep behind him and turned to see his wife standing in the doorway. Her crimson dress was a slash of color against the pale marble. Her face was a mask of fury. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice calm and even. "You humiliated me," she shrieked, her voice echoing in the empty room. "In front of everyone. My friends, Your business partners. You turned me into a villain, a monster. You did that yourself, Victoria, he said, his voice as cold as the ice in his glass. I simply turned on the lights. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey. This is not a game, he said. This is not a social spat that will be forgotten by morning. This is a fundamental disagreement about the kind of people we are, the kind of world we want to live in. I am your wife, she screamed, her voice cracking. Are you? He said, his voice a soft, dangerous whisper. A wife is a partner, a confidant, a person you trust, you respect. You, Victoria, have shown yourself to be none of those things. You are a liability, a cruel, petty, shallow liability. And I, for one, have had enough. He placed his glass on a nearby table with a soft, final clink. I have asked Arthur to draw up the divorce papers, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He will have them for you in the morning. He turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving her standing there, alone and shivering, in the ruins of her gilded cage. The silence Victoria was left in was a living thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket. For a long moment, she didn't move. The divorce papers. The words echoed in the vast emptiness of the ballroom. It was impossible, unthinkable. Theirs was not a marriage of love, but of alliance. A merger of two powerful families, the Sterlings and the Vanderbilts. It was a contract, a fortress built of mutual interests and public image. And he was going to tear it down over a maid's brat? The shock slowly gave way to a volcanic fury. She, Victoria Vanderbilt Sterling, was not someone you discarded. She was not a failed investment to be written off. She was the queen of this city's social scene, a power in her own right. He had humiliated her, yes, but he had also made a fatal error. He had declared war, and the Vanderbilts had never lost a war. She marched out of the ballroom, her crimson dress a banner of defiance. She went not to their shared bedroom, but to her own private wing of the mansion. She slammed the door, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the silent house. She picked up her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. The first call was to her father, the second to her brother, the third to a man whose number was not saved under his real name, a man who specialized in digging up dirt and destroying reputations. I have a job for you, she said, her voice a sliver of ice. The name is Sarah, a maid. I want you to find everything. Every mistake she's ever made, every secret she's ever kept. I want to bury her. And then, as an afterthought, she added, and I want to know everything there is to know about a dead soldier named Michael Donovan. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her apartment window. For a moment, everything was normal. Then, the events of the previous night came rushing back, a tidal wave of memory. The Coca-Cola, the blue dress, the applause, the kindness in Mr. Sterling's eyes, the cold fury in his wife's. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. What did it all mean? Was she fired? Was she in danger? She looked over at Lily, who was still fast asleep, a small, peaceful smile on her face. For Lily, it had been a fairy tale. For Sarah, it felt more like the beginning of a nightmare. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from an unknown number. Good morning, Sarah. This is James Sterling. Please do not go to the mansion today. Take the week off. Paid, of course. I will be in touch soon to discuss a more permanent arrangement. Your safety and Lily's are my top priority. If you need anything at all, call this number. Thomas will be outside your building at 10 a.m. He has something for you. Sarah read the message 3 times. A more permanent arrangement? Safety? The words sent a shiver of fear down her spine. This was bigger than a spilled drink. This was a war, and she and Lily were somehow caught in the middle. At precisely 10 a.m., she saw the familiar Blacktown car pull up to the curb. Thomas, the elderly driver, got out. He was carrying a large, unmarked box. He met her in the lobby of her building, his face kind but etched with a professional discretion. Mr. Sterling sends his regards, he said, handing her the box. He asked me to give you this, and to tell you that you are not alone in this. Sarah took the box. It was surprisingly heavy. Thank you, Thomas, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Back in her apartment, she opened the box. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were several things. First, there was a thick envelope. She opened it to find a cashier's check for $50,000. The memo line simply read, "For a new start." Underneath the envelope was a brand new laptop computer and a state-of-the-art cell phone, still in their packaging. And at the bottom of the box, there was a simple, leather-bound frame. Inside the frame was a faded black and white photograph. It was a picture of two young men in army uniforms, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. They couldn't have been more than 20 years old. One of the men was a younger, rawer version of James Sterling. The other had Lily's eyes. Sarah sank onto her sofa, the photograph trembling in her hands. It was her grandfather, Michael Donovan, the man she had never known, the man her mother had spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. The hero. She had always known her grandfather was a war hero. She had the medals to prove it, tucked away in a small wooden box. But she had never known he was friends with a billionaire. She had never known the connection that tied her humble life to the opulence of the Sterling mansion. The new phone, the one from the box, buzzed to life. It was a text from the same number as before. "I think it's time we talked. About your grandfather. And about your future." James Sterling was in his downtown office, a sleek, minimalist space on the top floor of the Sterling Tower. The city sprawled out beneath him, a kingdom of concrete and glass. He had not slept. He had spent the night strategizing, making calls, moving the pieces on the board. His first move had been to secure Sarah and Lily. The money, the new electronics, it was more than just a gift. It was a message to Victoria, who would undoubtedly have them watched, that they were now under his protection. The new phone and computer were encrypted, untraceable. He was building a digital fortress around them. His second move was defensive. He knew Victoria's family, the Vanderbilts. They were old money, a sprawling dynasty with deep roots and a history of playing dirty. He had his own team of investigators, the best in the business, digging into their finances, their political connections, their personal lives. He was preparing for a storm. But his third move, the one that truly mattered, was about the past. He looked at a copy of the same photograph he had sent to Sarah, which sat on his desk. Michael Donovan. Mikey, his best friend. The brother he had chosen. They had grown up together, two boys from different worlds. James, the son of a wealthy industrialist. Mikey, the son of a plumber. But in the foxholes of a forgotten war, none of that mattered. They had saved each other's lives more times than they could count. They had made a pact. If anything ever happened to one of them, the other would look out for their family. Always. Mikey had been killed in the final days of the war, a hero's death that had earned him a posthumous Medal of Honor. James had been the one to escort his body home. He had stood by the graveside as they buried his friend, and he had made a promise to a grieving widow and a small, heartbroken daughter, Mikey's daughter, Sarah's mother. He had tried to keep that promise. He had set up a trust fund, had sent checks every year. But Mikey's widow was a proud woman. She had eventually returned the money, insisting they could make it on their own. And James, consumed by the demands of building his own empire, had let the connection fade. He had respected her wishes, but he had never stopped watching from a distance. He knew when Sarah's mother had passed away. He knew when Sarah had a child of her own. And he knew when, out of desperation, she had taken a job as a maid in his own home. He had kept his distance, telling himself it was what she would want. He had told himself it was enough to ensure she was treated fairly, paid well. He had not wanted to interfere, to intrude. But now, he saw that his silence had been a mistake, a form of neglect. He had allowed his friend's granddaughter to be humiliated under his own roof. It was a failure of duty, a betrayal of his promise. And it was a mistake he would now spend the rest of his life correcting. His intercom buzzed. It was his lawyer, Arthur Vance. "James, we have a problem," Arthur said, his voice grim. "Victoria's brother just made a move. He's called an emergency meeting of the Sterling Enterprises Board of Directors. He's trying to get you removed as CEO." James felt a flicker of something that might have been amusement. It was a predictable move. Bold, but foolish. "On what grounds?" James asked. "Moral turpitude," Arthur said, the words dripping with disdain. "He's claiming your erratic behavior at the gala, your public liaison with a member of your domestic staff, and your unstable decision to file for divorce have made you unfit to lead the company. He's trying to paint you as a man having a midlife crisis, a man who is a danger to the shareholders." "Let him try," James said, his voice a low, confident growl. "Set up the meeting, Arthur. I'll be there. And tell the board to bring their popcorn. They're about to see a show." Victoria's attack was a blitzkrieg, a multi-front assault designed to overwhelm and destroy. Her brother's move on the company was just the beginning. The gossip columns, which she controlled with an iron fist, were suddenly filled with stories painting James as a philandering, unstable tyrant. Anonymous sources spoke of his coldness, his ruthlessness, his inappropriate relationship with his maid. Her PR machine went into overdrive, spinning a tale of a long-suffering wife, a woman who had stood by her difficult husband for years, only to be cast aside for a younger, lower-class woman. They painted Sarah as a gold digger, a schemer who had used her innocent daughter to seduce a vulnerable billionaire. The world that had celebrated Sarah and Lily at the gala was now turning against them. The whispers changed from sympathy to suspicion. Sarah, who had only wanted a quiet life, was suddenly a public figure, a character in a sordid soap opera. She stayed in her apartment, a prisoner in her own home. The money from James sat on her table, untouched. She was too proud, too afraid to use it. She watched the news, read the articles online, and felt a wave of nausea. They were twisting everything, turning a moment of kindness into something ugly and sordid. They were calling her names, questioning her character, her motherhood. Lily was oblivious to the storm raging outside. She played with her dolls, watched cartoons, and chattered happily about the beautiful blue dress and the nice man who had called her a princess. Her innocence was a fragile shield, and Sarah knew she had to protect it, no matter the cost. On the third day of her self-imposed exile, there was a knock on the door. It wasn't the gentle tap of a delivery person. It was a hard, authoritative rap. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She looked through the peephole and saw two people, a man and a woman, dressed in severe black suits. They looked like government agents. She opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" "Are you Sarah Donovan?" the woman asked, her voice clipped and official. "Yes," Sarah said, her hand tightening on the doorknob. "We're from Child Protective Services," the man said, holding up a badge. "We've received an anonymous report of child endangerment and neglect. We need to come in." Sarah's blood ran cold. Child Protective Services. It was a lie, a vicious, calculated lie, but how could she prove it? They had the badges, the official titles. They had the power. "There must be some mistake," she stammered, her body forming a protective barrier in the doorway. "My daughter is perfectly safe." "That's what we're here to determine, Ms. Donovan," the woman said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "If you refuse us entry, we'll have to come back with the police." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sarah knew she had no choice. With a trembling hand, she opened the door. The two agents stepped inside, their eyes sweeping over the small, clean apartment. Lily, hearing the strange voices, came padding out of her room, her favorite doll clutched in her hand. She stopped when she saw the strangers, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "Hello there," the male agent said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What's your name?" Lily hid behind her mother's legs, peeking out shyly. The agents began their inspection. They looked in the refrigerator, checked the cupboards, ran a finger over the top of a bookshelf, searching for dust. They asked Sarah a barrage of questions, their tone accusatory. "Where does the child sleep? What does she eat for breakfast? Are there any firearms in the home? Has she been exposed to any domestic disputes?" It was a violation, a cold, bureaucratic invasion of her life. Sarah answered their questions with a quiet, steely dignity, but inside, she was crumbling. This was Victoria's doing. She was trying to take her daughter. The thought was a physical pain, a knife twisting in her gut. The female agent knelt down to speak to Lily. "Has your mommy been sad lately, honey? Does she ever yell at you?" Lily just shook her head, clinging tighter to Sarah. The questioning went on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the agents stood in the middle of the living room, their clipboards filled with notes. "Well, the apartment appears to be in order," the woman conceded. But the report mentioned instability. A recent traumatic event involving a public altercation. "It was not an altercation," Sarah said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "My daughter was assaulted, and she was defended." "That's not what the report says," the man countered. "The report says the child was used as a pawn in a dispute between you and your employer's wife, causing significant emotional distress." It was a perfect, venomous twist of the truth. Victoria had not only called them, she had crafted a narrative, a story that painted Sarah as the unstable one, the one at fault. Just as Sarah was about to lose all hope, Her new phone, the one James had given her, began to ring. She looked at the screen. It was him. "Excuse me," she said to the agents, her voice trembling. She stepped into the kitchen and answered the call. "Sarah." James's voice was calm, a rock in the storm. "Are there two people in your apartment who claim to be from Child Protective Services?" "Yes," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "How did you know?" "I have a team monitoring all of Victoria's communications," he said, a hint of steel in his voice. This was a predictable move from a desperate woman. "Put me on speakerphone, Sarah, and hold the phone out for your guests to hear." Sarah did as he asked. She walked back into the living room, holding the phone out. "It's for you," she said. James Sterling's voice, amplified by the small speaker, filled the apartment. It was not loud, but it carried an authority that was absolute. "To the man and woman in Ms. Donovan's apartment," he began, "I know you are not from Child Protective Services. I have the director of the city's CPS division on another line, and he has confirmed that no agents were dispatched to this address today. He has, however, dispatched the police. They should be arriving in approximately 90 seconds. The two agents' faces went pale. Their professional demeanor evaporated, replaced by raw panic. Furthermore, James's voice continued, as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "I have your names. You are private investigators, hired by my wife. The man who runs your agency is an old acquaintance of mine. He is currently on his way to my office to explain why his employees are impersonating government officials, which, as I'm sure you know, is a federal crime. You have 60 seconds to leave that apartment before the police arrive. I suggest you use them." The two imposters didn't wait for the 60 seconds to be up. They practically ran for the door, their clipboards and their false authority abandoned. Sarah watched them go, her body trembling with a mixture of fear, relief, and a dawning sense of awe. "Sarah," James's voice said, now gentle again. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she whispered, sinking onto the sofa. "Thank you. You have nothing to thank me for," he said. "I am simply cleaning up a mess that I should have dealt with long ago. Stay inside. Keep the door locked. This will all be over soon. I promise." The call ended. Sarah pulled Lily into her arms, holding her tight. The nightmare was not over, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. She was not alone in this fight. She had a guardian, a powerful, unseen force fighting for her in a world she did not understand. The emergency board meeting of Sterling Enterprises was held in a room that felt more like a command center than a corporate office. A long, polished mahogany table was surrounded by 20 of the city's most powerful men and women. At the head of the table sat James Sterling, calm and impassive. Across from him sat Victoria's brother, William Vanderbilt, a man with his family's arrogance, but none of its charm. William began the proceedings. He spoke for nearly half an hour, his voice dripping with false concern. He painted a picture of James as a brilliant but troubled man, a man whose recent actions were erratic and damaging to the company's reputation. He spoke of the scandal at the gala, the unseemly affair with a maid, the hasty and emotional decision to file for divorce. "We are all concerned for James," William concluded, his eyes sweeping across the board members. "But our primary duty is to the shareholders, and the shareholders require a steady hand at the helm. I am therefore moving for a temporary, and I stress, temporary, leave of absence for Mr. Sterling to give him time to sort out his personal affairs." The room was silent. All eyes turned to James. He stood up slowly, his presence filling the room. He did not look at William. He looked at the faces of the board members, men and women he had known for years. "Mr. Vanderbilt is a compelling storyteller," James began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "The story he tells is one of scandal, of instability. It is a good story, but it is not the true story." He pressed a button on a small remote control. A large screen behind him came to life. It showed a grainy, black and white photograph. The photograph of him and Mikey Donovan in their army uniforms. "The true story," James said, his voice now resonating with a deep, personal emotion, began a long time ago. "It's a story about a promise. The man on the right is Sergeant Michael Donovan. He was my best friend. He died in my arms, saving my life and the lives of 3 other men. His last words to me were a request. Look out for my family, Jimmy. Don't let them be alone." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. I tried to keep that promise, he continued. But I failed. I lost touch. I got busy building this company, this empire. And his family, proud and self-reliant, made their own way. His granddaughter, a woman named Sarah, ended up working as a maid. In my own house. He clicked the remote again. The screen now showed a crystal-clear security camera image. It was the image of Victoria, her face twisted in a cruel sneer, pouring a glass of Coca-Cola over the head of a small, blonde girl. A collective gasp went through the room. My wife, James said, his voice now dangerously soft, did not approve of the help's children being in her house. So she decided to teach a 10-year-old girl a lesson in her place. This is the scandal Mr. Vanderbilt speaks of. My erratic behavior was to defend this child, to show her, and her mother, the dignity and respect they deserve. The respect her grandfather, a Medal of Honor recipient, earned for them with his own blood. He looked directly at William Vanderbilt, his eyes like chips of flint. You speak of the company's reputation. Let me tell you about reputation. Sterling Enterprises is not just a collection of assets and stock prices. It is a symbol of integrity, of strength, of honor. We do not bully children here. We do not abuse our power. We do not punish the weak and reward the cruel. He turned back to the board. The woman my wife hired to impersonate a CPS official and terrorize Sarah and her daughter is currently in federal custody. The private investigator who took the job has provided a full confession, implicating my wife directly. The Vanderbilt family name, I'm afraid, is about to be connected to a scandal far greater than a spilled drink. He let that sink in. The threat was not veiled. It was a declaration of mutual destruction. This is not about a personal affair, James concluded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. This is about the soul of this company. It is about who we are and what we stand for. You can vote for Mr. Vanderbilt's version of the future, a future built on arrogance and cruelty. Or you can stand with me. You can stand for honor. The choice is yours. He sat down. The silence in the room was absolute. William Vanderbilt's face was ashen. He had come with a knife to a gunfight, and he knew it. He had played corporate politics. James had played for keeps. It was Arthur Vance who broke the silence. He cleared his throat and said, I believe we have a motion on the floor. All in favor of Mr. Sterling's temporary leave of absence. Not a single hand was raised. All opposed. Every hand in the room went up. The war was over. The aftermath was swift and total. The story of Victoria's cruelty, backed by the security footage and the confession of the private investigator, became a national headline. The Vanderbilt family, faced with a PR nightmare and the threat of federal charges against their daughter, capitulated completely. Victoria agreed to a quiet, immediate divorce, accepting a settlement that was a fraction of what she would have otherwise received, on the condition that all criminal charges were dropped. She disappeared from the social scene, retreating to Europe in a self-imposed exile of shame. James Sterling, his position as CEO more secure than ever, turned his attention to fulfilling his promise. He set up a charitable foundation in Michael Donovan's name, dedicated to supporting the families of fallen soldiers. He appointed Sarah to run it. He offered her a salary that was more than she had ever dreamed of, a beautiful new home in a quiet, safe neighborhood, and a full scholarship for Lily at the best private school in the city. At first, Sarah refused. It was too much. It was charity. But James sat with her, not in a fancy office, but in her small apartment, and explained it to her in a way she could understand. This is not charity, Sarah, he said, his voice gentle. This is a debt I owe your grandfather. He saved my life. The least I can do is give his family the life he would have wanted for them. Please, let me do this. For him. And so she accepted. A year later, Sarah stood on the stage at the Foundation's first annual gala. She was no longer the invisible maid, but a confident, eloquent woman, a passionate advocate for the families she now served. She spoke of her grandfather's courage, of the sacrifices made by soldiers and their families. She spoke of kindness, of dignity, of the importance of standing up for what is right. In the front row, James Sterling watched her, a quiet pride in his eyes. Beside him sat Lily, now 11 years old, her blonde hair shining under the lights. She was no longer the whisper of a girl in a house full of secrets. She was a princess who knew her own worth, a girl who knew that the truest strength was not in wealth or power, but in a kind and courageous heart. The world had seen a billionaire's reaction. But the reaction was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. It was the moment a promise, long dormant, was reawakened. It was the moment a debt of honor was finally paid. And for a maid's daughter and the billionaire who had saved her, it was the beginning of a new family. A family forged not by blood, but by courage, kindness, and the enduring legacy of a hero. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.